Hockey stick dreams, hairy back realities. Hockey stick plans are a natural outcome of the strategy game and are too often coupled only with timid moves. When successive hopeful forecasts pile up against reality, you get the ugliest chart in strategy, the hairy back. But real hockey sticks do happen. In a recent survey, CEOs attributed only 50% of decisions on target setting and strategy to facts and analytics. 50%. The other half they attributed to the strategy process and the dynamics in the strategy room. So, tasks like setting the right ambition levels and priorities are not just difficult technically, they also take place right at the intersection of the biases and agency problems we've discussed. The tasks are deep in the territory of the social side of strategy, where collective aspirations collide with individual fear, ambitions, rivalry, and bias. Even when the environment is perfectly understood, target setting is noisy. Overconfidence, blind extrapolation, competition for resources, the treadmill of rising expectations, or the typical desire for a goal setter to add stretch can cause targets to be set too high. Sandbagging, negotiations, and risk aversion will cause targets to come out too low. The consequence: hockey sticks and hairy backs. The rise of the hairy back. As we've seen, the dynamics in the strategy room often lead to hockey stick plans. Overly conservative for the first couple of years, then overly aggressive longer term. These lines sail upward on the graph after a brief early dip to account for upfront investment. Over the years, unrealized hockey sticks string together, and the ugly cousin of the hockey stick appears, the hairy back. A real example of one of these, we have a drawer full of them, is shown in Exhibit 8. Look familiar? Do try this at home. Exhibit 8 shows the performance of a major multinational. The company planned for a breakout in 2011, only to achieve flat results. Undeterred, the team drew another hockey stick for 2012, then 2013, then 2014, then 2015, even as actual results stayed roughly flat, then trailed off. Hairy backs are common in sales, profit, utilization performance, you name it. Boards fear them, investors know them, and CEOs try to avoid them, but they keep happening. Some stem from overconfidence, a very human trait. When asked about their driving skills, 93% of U.S. drivers and 69% of Swedish drivers said they were above average. Asked to rate their safety, 88% of U.S. drivers and 77% of Swedes put themselves in the top half. These biases are shared by experts in many fields. The more experienced people are, the more likely they are to suffer from overconfidence. Social dynamics in businesses reward overconfidence. Whoever got promoted based on a growth forecast that didn't sail upward? Some, raised on a diet of self-help books, may even believe that setting stretch goals will motivate people, no matter how unrealistic these targets may be. So, quite a number of hockey sticks appear because people actually believe they can pull them off. Getting to yes. Others appear because people are playing social games. While the planning process is officially about strategy, the real goal is to get a yes for resources in that all-important budget for next year. Those resources are how managers maintain status and position themselves for the kinds of results that might get them promoted, even perhaps to the top job. Managers don't assume they'll get everything they request. They come in with a big ask, so that even after the expected haircut, they'll get adequate resources. Besides, the punishment for not getting resources is generally greater than for not having a hockey stick pan out. You've seen the game, and probably even played it. When a requirement is set, such as a 15% internal rate of return on investments, plans magically morph to just clear that bar. Nobody ever walked into a planning session intending to get a no to a plan. Nobody ever wants to lose the competition for resources. Imagine a manager coming into the room with a realistic but flat target. You'd wonder, is this person capable or ambitious enough? Has he really thought through his strategy with any creativity or flair? Doesn't he trust his ability to execute? No, hockey stick it is. It's so much easier to believe what we want to be true. The CEO won't approve every hockey stick, but needs a growth story somewhere. Executive teams make lots of decisions, and it's hard to evaluate all the content all the time. So the hockey stick plan that gets backed generally comes from the person with the best track record. The CEO takes a version of that plan to the board, which may push back on some details, but generally supports the plans of the CEO. That's not the end of the story. A haircut from finance. Then the CFO, doing his or her job to arbitrate resources, gets hold of the plans, and the next phase of the game begins. The one that gets to the ultimate goal, that all-important first-year budget. The CFO, of course, can't live with any performance dip that a hockey stick shows for the first couple of years, the valley of investment, when results decline before the major growth kicks in. Too much cost-cutting would be required to cover for that dip. The dip would also consume the safety cushion the CFO wants to have in the budget to cover for the downside caused by something unexpectedly going wrong over the course of the year, as it always does. The CEO, while supporting the hockey stick aspirations, also recognizes the need for a cushion. There isn't much worse than missing your numbers after assuring the board you're safe. So the CFO gets to pull back resources, smoothing out the first year of the performance curve. Here is an email in one of our inboxes that typifies the point. Debriefing from a meeting with the global CFO discussing a major strategic reorientation of a business unit, another executive wrote, "She believes in the strategy, but wants, like any good CFO, to see how it can be done without the short-term earnings hit. She homed in immediately on the key issue of whether to spend on accelerated CapEx in the next 2 years. Regardless of whether a hockey stick was overly optimistic, the result of social gaming, or a real opportunity, this is usually the point when it becomes all but certain that the promised success won't materialize. The investment that was supposed to lay the foundation for growth has taken a haircut. But for some reason, all too often the ambition level for growth remains largely unchanged. At the end of the first year, sure enough, performance isn't living up to the hockey stick promise. Attribution bias kicks in. The problem can't be the fault of those cutting the investment. After all, managers signed off on their budgets. The missed target is then blamed on the most convenient cause available, which is usually some one-off event, unseasonable weather, an IT outage, etc. Even though such one-off occurrences seem to happen every year. With failure dismissed as an externality, the management team closes ranks and decides to double down and re-establish the goal. We lost a year, but we're going to get back on track. The next hair sprouts. As Daniel Kahneman and Dan Lavallo explained in their work on the human tendency toward bold forecasts and timid plans, we're inclined to see exceptional growth in sales, earnings, and other metrics, but won't make the big moves that could generate those results. They published their paper 25 years ago, but we keep making the same errors. In essence, we are saying, we're going to do a ton better next year by doing the same things we did this year, or maybe just a little more. Bold forecasts. Mark Twain beautifully summarized the typical problem with bold forecasts when he said, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." There is a lot of "we know for sure" around. In our speeches, we often ask for fun, how many people in the room believe that the Great Wall of China is the only man-made object visible from space? It continues to blow our minds that most people know that to be true, except It isn't. The claim, first made in 1754, has been known to be untrue since 1961. The first cosmonaut, Yuri Gagarin, checked it out when he orbited the Earth that year. He was unable to pick out the Great Wall with his naked eye, and no space traveler since then has, because the wall is made from rock that is indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Yet most people still know that the Great Wall is visible from space. When it comes to forecasting, several silent killers can creep into our strategy room. Some of the most popular ones include a lack of a proper baseline, errors about performance attribution, and especially the ways we deal with uncertainty. The lack of a proper baseline. Our forecasts are built on things we believe we know. During the first internet boom, one of our clients was considering investing $1 billion in a new fiber optic cable network across the U.S., based on the estimates of the explosive growth in communication. It was clear that the advent of the internet would fuel demand for fiber capacity, and many rushed in to stake a claim. The more the internet revolutionized business and how people transacted, the more fiber capacity would be required. Everybody knew that. But that explosive, seemingly unlimited demand wasn't the whole picture. There was already a lot of fiber in use, and its capacity would increase at the rapid pace at which the routers that dispatched signals through the fiber improved. Then there was dark fiber to consider, installed capacity that was yet to be used, plus the announced plans of competitors for installing additional capacity. Add it all up, and the expected capacity would exceed even the most outrageous demand projections for the following 5 years. Because the company took the time to do a proper baseline and saw that what everybody knew just did not translate into a need for additional capacity, the company decided to stop the project and saved itself the $1 billion allocated to that hockey stick. The fact that barely a year later the internet bubble imploded was merely icing on the cake for their decision. Many others had invested without a proper baseline, simply acting on what they thought they knew, and paid dearly for it. Another evergreen problem with baselines is planning for market share gains. In the early days of the personal computer, every electronics company worth its silicon decided it could capture 20% of the rapidly expanding U.S. market, ignoring how many others were staking that same claim. 8 companies tried for 20%. The industry hopelessly overbuilt, and the shakeout was painful. Bold forecasts are hard to avoid. It's too easy to pull cells across the screen in Excel without paying heed to how hard it might have been just to get to the current point. You, like us, might have friends who plan to hit great times in a marathon, but fail to meet their expectations because they undertrained, firmly believing that they were already much fitter than they actually were. Businesses make the same sorts of mistakes. Errors in performance attribution. Errors in assessing business momentum are always easy to make. Often, performance is mistaken for capability. We've done so well, so we must be better than our competition and will continue to prosper no matter what, even though external conditions may have contributed to the success. These types of momentum mistakes are harder to spot when you're doing well because the need to understand the underlying dynamics feels less urgent. If a company is prospering in an environment where it can raise prices rapidly, for instance, it may convince itself that it is becoming ever more efficient in its sales operations simply because the costs of sales are outpaced by revenue growth. When the pricing environment stiffens, however, the company may discover all kinds of inefficiencies that crept into the system. During the dot-com boom, several North American consumer electronics contract manufacturing companies expanded rapidly by acquiring factories of their customers left and right. Their share prices rose exponentially around stories of unmatched efficiency and logistics capabilities. When the growth story ended with the bust of the internet bubble, it came to light that, during the rapid growth, even the most basic integration of newly acquired operations had been neglected, exacerbating the effects of dropping volumes. The recovery took years, and several companies became acquisition targets themselves. We are prone to attribution errors even when they hurt us. We all cherish, for instance, the friendly family doctor. However, patients of doctors who are in the top quartile for customer satisfaction are associated with 9% higher medical costs and 25% higher mortality rates. A doctor who makes you feel good can put you in danger, but try telling that to a happy patient. A realistic perspective on corporate performance also tends to get obfuscated by stretch goals, or BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. In setting those, leaders often put hope over facts. Managers with exceptional track records seem especially prone to willing their way to performance by setting unrealistically high performance bars, at times with negative effects on the morale of their teams. Many business books help to extend the perception that greatness can be easily achieved. Building from selected case studies, they imply that there is exceptional performance waiting just around the corner, as long as you adopt the right formula. It ain't. For a start, this loose causality ignores the gigantic role of industry dynamics. Not everybody can be an Apple, no matter how long we cite them as a heroic example. In fact, probably nobody can. More precisely, in our sample, 1 out of 2,393 can. Still, books are written and people try, secretly attributing more capabilities to themselves than they have. How we deal with uncertainty. Predictions are difficult, especially about the future, quipped Yogi Berra, and before him, Niels Bohr. This rings especially true when trying to run a proper strategy process. Uncertainty is not only everywhere in and around strategy, it is the very reason why we need strategy. Without uncertainty, we just need a plan to go from A to B. The problem in dealing with uncertainty in the strategy process is not so much the analysis. While uncertainty is often missing from the analysis, and even proper scenario planning is still rather rare, the issue is, surprise, the social side of strategy. Why? At some level, it is easy for the CEO to deal with uncertainty by playing a portfolio game, knowing that not every bet has to pay off for the total play to work. The problem is that what is a portfolio game on the corporate level becomes a matter of all-in commitment for an individual business unit leader. We have all heard the saying, "You are your numbers." The saying isn't, "Well, that project only had a 50% chance of success, so I won't hold failure against him until he's had another similar failure or two." No, at the level of the unit leader, results are pretty much binary. You make it or you don't. It's the very existence of probabilities and uncertainties that allows the social game space to flourish. The issue is noisy signals. We can't really tell if that poor result was a noble failure, inasmuch as we can't tell if the great result was blind luck. Was it a case of best efforts on a good bet but a bad roll of the dice? Was it a more pernicious failure of planning or execution? Was it perhaps just a bad strategy to start with? Uncertainty doesn't only mean we can't see around the next corner. Uncertainty also invades the past. That dust cloud in the rearview mirror means you can't really tell where you came from. Of course, in running a business, there are many elements that you just can't control. The fate of the economy, political events, and your competitors' actions. In most strategy rooms, the question on how to deal with uncertainty looms large. It's the 600-pound gorilla in the room. Actually, it's sitting in the middle of the table. It has long teeth, and it's drooling. Nobody wants to talk about it. It's a complex topic that can easily get in the way of getting a yes to the plan. But it's sitting there. So managers presenting strategies have sophisticated approaches on how to deal with the gorilla. They have to get a yes, not a maybe. That means they have to inspire confidence in the outcomes they are promising, providing at least an illusion of certainty. Here are some of our all-time favorites among the ways that people deal with uncertainty in the strategy room. First, ignoring uncertainty. Many strategy presentations we see start with an analyst-based projection of the market. Not scenarios, not a range of outcomes. They start with a most likely version of the future. And that's the last thing you heard about uncertainty in the presentation. From then on, you get single-point estimates for the plan, too, and it's a straight shot for the yes. What about treating uncertainty as an afterthought? The strategy room is a harsh place for most, and quite frankly, failure on that stage is not an option for most managers. Execution problems? Okay. A strategy that has gaps? We can fix that. But a strategy conversation about probabilities? You must be kidding. The result is a slide about risks on page 149 of a 150-page strategy deck. The presenter hopes to win a yes on funding before getting anywhere close to that far into the deck. That slide on page 149, titled something like Potential Risks and How to Mitigate Them, is there just so the presenter can say the issue is covered if the odd question about risks should pop up. Finally, pretending to deal with uncertainty. In some cases, uncertainty is actually discussed in the strategy room. Say geopolitical risks are threatening sales growth in an emerging market, or a competitor could make an industry consolidating move. There will be a few scenarios, plus a discussion on which of them would be more likely or less likely to emerge. Then, one scenario is picked as base case, and that's probably the last thing you hear about uncertainty. Strategy clear, job done. There are, of course, businesses that could not survive without dealing with uncertainty. For example, in asset management and other financial businesses, risk-weighted metrics are normal. The difference is that they are moving money around. In more tangible businesses, you move people and money around, and also the careers and reputations of business leaders. While the calculator loses reputation by wrongly calculating risk, the manager loses reputation by giving up resources. All these common practices and related errors can lay the foundation for setting the wrong ambition levels, and consequently, flawed strategies. To be clear, there is nothing wrong about having bold targets. In fact, you need bold targets to move upward on the power curve. But those ambitions need to be anchored in the realities of a business and the evolving context it operates in. This book is about how to set bold targets, but to do so in a way that is equally matched by the boldness of the moves needed to achieve them. Timid plans. A recent McKinsey study of a large sample of big companies showed that over 90% of budgets on a business unit level are statistically explained by the previous year's budget levels. Most companies evolve in incremental steps as a result of cautious plans. But how do timid plans gel with overly ambitious forecasts and targets? Well, it starts with us being human. When it comes to making real decisions, in particular when these decisions have implications for our own families, careers, or wealth, many of us tend to be risk-averse. You might have participated in surveys your bank is obliged to conduct to determine your investor profile. The results of these surveys and many experiments by behavioral scientists clearly show that most of us are much more willing to forego a large upside to avoid a small downside. We simply do not like losing. But when that individual risk aversion gets projected onto corporate strategy, we hit problems. A large, diversified corporation with many investors, themselves diversified, will have a far greater risk tolerance than the middle manager who is the gatekeeper to the plans. The avoidance of downside at almost all costs happens all too often in the strategy room. Big moves are rarely proposed and even less frequently accepted. The CEO of one of the largest Hong Kong property companies complained to us that none of his managers ever comes up with big ideas. When we asked him why, he responded, "Well, whenever they speak up, They cannot really articulate themselves, so I shut them down after half a minute. Guess what those who spoke up will do in the next meeting? Think about it. How often have you seen a business unit manager come into the annual planning cycle with a strong M&A strategy? How often have you seen moves proposed that would truly change the game in an industry? That just does not happen that often. Most discussions in the strategy room are about intensifying efforts to gain a few % more market share or to squeeze out a few more percentage points of margin. That will show progress. Nobody will get fired. As we've said, we will show that this belief in incremental progress is a fallacy. Bigger moves not only increase your odds of success, but reduce the risk of sliding down. Still, the fear of downside risk pervades the planning environment. Nearly 8 out of 10 executives surveyed by our firm tell us that their companies are more geared toward confirming existing hypotheses in their strategy processes than in testing new ones. Going for incremental moves is the norm, not the exception. Corporate peanut butter. Avoiding conflicts in the team, being practical about the business, giving every team member a fair chance, keeping the motivation up. All these arguments contribute to resource stickiness. Corporate planning becomes more like your breakfast strategy, spreading resources thinly like peanut butter on bread across all parts of the business, making sure everyone is covered. Almost by default, peanut buttering ensures that even if a hockey stick were possible, it would be hard for a business unit leader to get all the resources needed to pull it off. One of our high-tech clients with a core computing business with $26 billion in revenue wanted to build another pillar for growth. The company even went so far as to free up some resources from R&D in the capital budget. But then it decided to pursue 17 growth opportunities in parallel. When an M&A opportunity came along in an attractive services business, which would likely have provided that growth pillar, the resources to execute the deal were not available because 16 other managers were drawing on them for their respective initiatives. The deal didn't happen. Corporate peanut butter almost guarantees that you won't make a big enough move to get to the top of the power curve. Shooting for the known. At the other end of the business calendar, when it gets to incentives, bonuses, and promotions, there lies another cause for timid plans. We all want to succeed, of course. But that means that most of us will vastly prefer a P90 plan, one that will hit with a 90% chance, over a P50 plan, which we would hit only 50% of the times we try. In fact, a lot of people we work with would quietly admit they only agree to budget targets that they feel confident they can hit almost for sure, P100, save any completely unexpected disruptions. Yet when we ask CEOs what would be fair in terms of misses, many of them say that every 3 to 4 years a leader should miss a plan if the plan has been stretched enough, i.e. P60 to P75 plans. What a difference in perspective. The head of operations for a large high-tech industrial company, actually the same one we just mentioned, told us recently, "We were beaten up badly earlier this year for missing a target. I'm not going to risk that again. I understand we might get to gold standard performance by the end of the year, but let's first get to the performance level written in the annual plan and then see where we go from there." The problem being that, by that time, any chance of reaching the more ambitious target by the end of the year had passed. With all the timidity baked into us and into the process, even bold plans can't shake the lethargy. Here's the really confounding thing, though. While hockey sticks routinely produce the dreaded hairy backs, real hockey sticks do exist. And those real hockey sticks are how companies typically make major moves upward on the power curve. Look at the power curve. Companies in the top quintile earn 30 times as much as the average company in the middle quintiles. Moving to that top quintile is almost by definition a hockey stick plan that creates enormous value for stakeholders. They do happen, but how? Real hockey sticks. Take a look at Exhibit 9. The gray line is the typical company, one that starts in the middle quintiles and is still there a decade later. The black line started in the same exact place, but was one of the companies to make it to the top quintile over the 10-year period. That black line sure looks like a hockey stick, a dip for the first 4 years, followed by rapid progress. Satya Nadella is CEO of Microsoft because he produced a real hockey stick. When he was promoted in 2011 to run a business at Microsoft that included its cloud services, the cloud was a small part of his business, which in turn was a modest-sized part of the whole company. But Nadella saw so much potential that he devoted almost all his personal time to the cloud business, along with an outsized proportion of his total resources. The business grew rapidly from revenue in the hundreds of millions to several billions, and Nadella was named CEO in early 2014. When NXP, the former semiconductor division of Philips, was spun out to private equity in 2006, the top team aggressively reallocated investments, given the winner-takes-all nature of the industry. NXP divested large and prestigious areas, such as chips for mobile and digital that consumed huge resources, and made big bets on chips for identification and automotive uses. The hockey stick growth of the chosen markets led to a 5-fold increase in market value over the following decade. Real hockey sticks do exist. The issue is separating the few real ones from the many fakes. The conundrum we are facing is that we should doubt every hockey stick, yet we often need one if we're to move up the power curve. So what does it take to actually move on the curve? Chapter 4. What are the odds? Strategy plays out in a world of probabilities, not certainties. But the odds are knowable. 8% of middle-tier companies manage to jump up into the top quintile of the power curve over a decade. But which ones? Once you've recognized the perils of the social side of strategy, you need a new paradigm. Consider poker and golf. In general, the more that skill is involved in a game like golf, the less you need to think about probabilities. If we played a world-class golfer, say the likes of Bernhard Langer or Rory McIlroy, we could be quite sure that we'd never win in a match against them, probably not even on a single hole. The more that luck, uncertainty, is involved in a game like poker, the more you need to ponder the odds. In poker, we'd not only have a chance to win a hand against a world-class player like Phil Hellmuth with his record 14 World Series of Poker bracelets, but would even occasionally beat him in a tournament, as people actually do. Hellmuth would certainly beat us over time, and we are probably well advised not to play him, but in the short run, we'd have a chance. Don't get us wrong. Business is obviously a matter of skill, of great skill. You don't just have cards dealt to you, you work hard for the assets and talents that you get to deploy. But there is uncertainty, and strategy is about how to deal with it. In any game, as in business, your goal needs to be to give yourself the best possible odds and to think in those terms. People shouldn't just get credit for winning and demerits for losing. If 5 companies each have an 80% chance of succeeding, that still means that one will usually fail. If 5 companies each have a 20% chance of success, one of the 5 is still likely to win. If all we see from these 10 companies together is 5 wins and 5 fails, it would be wrong to look at all of them the same way. Clearly, the superior strategy is the one with an 80% chance of success, and this is the one that should be given the credit, no matter whether you win or lose. Risk, of course, needs to be part of the probability discussion, too. If you have just a slim chance of winning, but a bet costs you little and the potential to win is huge, that still may be an investment worth making. The converse is true, too. An expensive investment that generates a high probability of a small success may be a bad idea. Poker players refer to the calculations as pot odds. If a $100 bet gives you a 20% chance of winning a $200 pot, you fold. Essentially, you are paying $100 for $40, that 20% of the $200. But a $100 bet that gives you a 20% chance of winning a $2,000 pot is one you make every time, because you're paying $100 to get $400, 20% of $2,000. So an assessment of your odds, competitive, market, regulatory, etc., needs to be part of your calculation. Leicester City's soccer team showed us in the 2015-16 English Premier League season that anything is possible, no matter the odds. The team, in early years sometimes relegated to the third division of the English Premier League, had made an improbable run through the second division and into the first division, but was considered to be such a long shot for the 2015-16 championship that bookmakers said there was a greater chance that Elvis Presley was still alive than that Leicester City would win the Premier League. And then, Leicester City won the title. As much fun as that was, many called it the biggest upset in the history of sports. We don't like to bank on being the exception. We always should assume we're going to be the rule. Okay, what are the odds? The knowable probability of success. We ran the numbers and can report that at the highest level, your odds look like those in Exhibit 10. This chart shows the odds of making a move across the quintiles of the power curve over a 10-year period if you started in the middle 3 quintiles. Your odds of going from the middle quintiles of the curve to the top quintile over a 10-year period are 8%. 8%. Let that sink in for a moment. Fewer than 1 in 10 companies make such a gain over a 10-year period. In the strategy room 10 years ago, you can imagine how many companies actually planned for such a performance improvement. Some might even have been convinced that they could pull it off. Probably most had their plans approved. Not even 1 in 10 made it. Wow, those are tough odds. Another way to show this is in Exhibit 11. The matrix tells you, based on where you started, what the odds are for where you'll end up. You should start getting familiar with that number 8 on the diagram. It's on the end of the middle row, which tells you the odds of ending in the top if you started in the middle. Next, look at the light gray diagonal reading 43, 78, 59, which tells you the odds of ending in the same location where you started. Turns out, the entire curve is rather sticky. It is hard to achieve any mobility at all. 78% of firms in the flat middle stayed put, and pity those 43% of bottom quintile firms that were still stuck there 10 years later. Now look at the top row. Those firms that started at the top. They have a 59% chance of still being in that quintile 10 years later. Nice. But that means you have a 41% chance of moving down the power curve, including a 15% chance of ending up in the bottom quintile. Now, plenty of firms are just going to move within the middle tier. The efforts to continuously sustain and upgrade performance are very important, and companies can deliver great results for shareholders by steadily improving their position on the curve. It's just that, given the extreme non-linearity of the curve, the giant leaps matter exponentially more. The odds of individual business units moving up and down the curve are roughly the same as for companies. And when companies make a big move up the curve, it is mostly because 1 or at most 2 of their businesses make a hockey stick improvement. When we looked at 101 companies that moved up at least 1 quintile and for which we had business unit level data, in 2/3 of the cases, it was just 1 of the units that moved up. Think about that for a moment. If you have a portfolio of 10 businesses, chances are that only 1 will make a hockey stick move over a 10-year period. And correctly identifying that 1 and feeding it all the resources it needs will most likely determine whether the company as a whole can make a significant move up the power curve. This insight about the need to find the 1 in 10 has huge implications for how you run a multi-business company. Having a plan that gives you a chance of moving up the power curve means, first and foremost, that you choose the right businesses in your portfolio to back. Their chances are 1 in 10 to show real improvement, and you probably only have to pick 1 or 2 businesses correctly. Flight paths of the upwardly mobile. Just as companies deliver economic profit in very different combinations, remember the discussion we had about Starbucks and Walmart? Movements on the power curve also result from different flight paths, i.e. combinations of ROIC and growth performance over time. When there are big movements up and down the power curve, these flight paths are spectacular. Starting from sea level, an average starting economic profit of $11 million a year in 2000 to 04 for the middle-tier companies, a move to the top generates an extra economic profit of $628 million annually on average, and a whopping 8.9 percentage points in ROIC. That's a gain of almost 1 point a year. Descents are just as crushing as ascents are exhilarating. Companies that went down lost $421 million from their annual economic profit on average and compressed their ROIC by 4.5 percentage points. Some flight paths are more likely to get you to the stars than others. Exhibit 12 shows what happens depending on your performance against the median firm. If you underperform on both growth and ROIC improvement, you have virtually no chance of getting off the ground. In fact, you have a 27% chance of falling from the middle to the bottom quintile. High growth with below median ROIC improvements gives you a small chance of an upside, but doesn't do much to reduce the downside risk. A performance-only strategy that focuses on improving ROIC but does not deliver above median growth is certainly playing it safe. You have almost zero chance of going down, but that strategy just gives you sample average odds of going up to the top quintile at 8%. The magic happens when both growth and ROIC improvements work in concert. Outperforming on both these levers is rewarded by a much higher chance of upward mobility, 19%. It is this increasing returns to scale dynamic that seems to matter, where each increment of growth makes the business not only bigger, but also better. Assets built around common shareable intellectual property, those with network or platform effects, and those with higher fixed costs enabling massive economics of scale, tend to have increasing returns to scale. What do those data mean for you? Well, if your hockey stick plan does not commit to improvements in both growth and ROIC, you might want to give it some more thought. Getting into the top quintile is harder than you might have expected, and the flight paths to the top underscore this challenge. A tale of 3 companies. A look at 3 companies will help us illustrate the different flight paths that companies can take, as shown in Exhibit 13. PCC is a U.S.-based maker of precision aircraft components, incidentally owned by Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway for the last few years. UNFI is an American distributor of natural, organic, and specialty foods and related products. DNP is a leading Japanese newspaper publisher. We picked these 3 because they started the period 2000 to 04 as next-door neighbors right in the middle of the power curve. Their outcomes could not have been more different, with PCC sailing up, UNFI staying fixed, and DNP sliding down. PCC pulled off a real hockey stick and went straight to the top quintile, generating a 27% CAGR, compound annual growth rate, in total shareholder return. They did this by making 4 big moves to double down in an industry with a strong tailwind: aerospace and defense. UNFI stayed in the middle of the curve, focusing on making productivity gains to offset the impact of adverse industry trends. DNP dropped to the bottom quintile because it chose to invest heavily via both CapEx and M&A in an industry with strong headwinds. Remember that printing was starting to be affected by digital media during that period. There are many angles to why all of that happened, and we will revisit some of them later. But we can be close to certain that in 2001, in each of their strategy rooms, their leaders were plotting for a move to the top. They were approving hockey stick plans. They were in good company. Across the power curve, everybody is under performance pressure, everybody has high hopes, and everybody is working incredibly hard for a better future. But as in the case of PCC, UNFI, and DNP, not everybody will see their dreams come true. More important, not everybody has the same chance of getting there. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Take a look at Exhibit 14. We are admittedly jumping ahead a bit, but take our word for the moment. Imagine you had a model that converted measurable attributes about a company into adjusted or conditional odds about how likely they were to succeed. Well, we do. Even though the average is 8%, it turns out that the chances of companies in the middle of making it to the top quintile are not only different, they are vastly different based on our model outputs. Just as the fates of our three companies were very different, so too were their starting odds, and they played out those odds. This is intriguing, isn't it? While the odds on average are just 8%, the odds for individual companies range from nearly 0% all the way to more than 80%. If the chances of making it to the top turn out to be so different for each of the companies on the power curve, then the question for CEOs, managers, and investors, of course, is, can those odds only be calculated after the fact, or could they have been known beforehand? We will explore this question for much of the rest of the book, and what business leaders can do about changing these odds. But let's start with a simple question. Why are the odds of success not in the strategy room when plans are being discussed? Where are the odds in the strategy room? Conversations in the strategy room tend to be like those at a consumer goods client of ours with $18 billion in revenue and the aspiration of achieving double-digit growth. The company did a great deal of planning, and the aspiration looked reasonable. But the company's actual odds of success hadn't yet made it into the room. The plan was built based on an inside view, building from the bottom-up estimates of the business units. A straightforward bit of research made the company reconsider. Publicly available information showed that among industry peers within the same revenue range as our client, only 10% generated sustained double-digit growth over 10 years. The question became, is our strategy actually better than 90% of our peers? Really? What makes us stand out, even though we'd performed like an average company over the prior 5 years, growing in the mid-single digits? To tell you the truth, bringing the actual odds into the strategy room did not make us very popular with the management team, but they did recalibrate the conversation in important ways. An executive told us, we had no idea that our value creation plans were so concentrated on so few areas. While the statistics of moving on the power curve are straightforward enough, those odds are rarely discussed in the strategy room. Companies in the top quintile tend to think that's where they belong. After all, they worked hard to get there and have developed impressive advantages over the competition. Why wouldn't they stay at the top of the heap? Likewise, companies in the middle quintiles tend to believe that they can move up. A chance that they'll drop to the bottom quintile? Why bother to even consider that possibility? We collectively have seen hundreds of strategic plans and can observe that the frequency of a plan for a company at the top of the curve to show a slide down is much lower than the real statistics we assembled for this book. Some plans do suggest a slide down, but not nearly the approximately 40% we observe in the real life of companies. With odds comes the explicit realization of risks, and loss aversion kicks in. Directly confronting risks can make people gun-shy, even when we're actually interested in having them take more risks. That can be a problem. The push for certainty. In strategy rooms, there often seems to be a push towards certainty, not odds. The work usually begins by entertaining lots of ideas and then testing them to winnow them down. Once there are some clear hypotheses, they are tested and refined with the idea of reducing uncertainty. While we don't always succeed, as those hairy backs show, we certainly attempt to do so. Forcing us to think in terms of probabilities works against that desire for certainty, that consensus that lets us all leave the room united on the plan and ready to execute. As one CEO in Italy told us, "I can't handle multiple realities." Pushed to consider various possible future scenarios, he said, "I'd rather pick the world I live in. It's much easier to tell people, you do this, you do that, than to live in a world of probabilistic uncertainty. With probabilities in the room, KPIs become harder to specify. Spreadsheets aren't exactly built for odds and ranges either. They're built for specific numbers, so it's hard to start dealing with a 75% chance that a value will be between X and Y, multiplied by the thousands of cells in a corporate budget." U.S. President Harry Truman famously said he wanted a one-handed economist so he would no longer have to listen to his experts say, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. You might have heard similar sentiments in your strategy room as people tried to bring discussions to a close. Life is not a scenario, make up your mind. Go left or right, but make a decision. Probabilities? I don't care what you do in your office, but when you come up here and present, tell us what you think. Issues of favoritism kick in too, that don't fit well with odds. As soon as we decide not to peanut butter resources and instead back business units that have the best prospects, then we're not only picking winners, we're also picking losers. But nobody likes to lose. We all know how hard people will then fight to protect their resources, and we are all prone to protect people who are our friends, or loyal, or both. Bringing probabilities in can make evaluating performance uncomfortably complex. The situation resembles the FBI office that hears about a gang that intends to rob one of 3 banks. The head of the office dispatches teams to all 3 banks to catch the thieves. Obviously, only one team will capture the gang, but the entire unit should receive the praise and rewards. But we know that most of the time, the ones who are in the right place at the right time will be lauded as heroes and rewarded. You are your numbers. Bill Parcells, an American football coach, illustrated this well by saying, "We are what our record says we are." In other words, quit claiming moral victories, whining about injuries, and reassuring fans that we'll get better. Even if you get your management team to think in terms of probabilities, those probabilities might be forgotten at the end of the year when it comes to performance evaluations. Either you made your numbers or you didn't. Ed Catmull at Pixar was very deliberate about how to allow for noble failures. He labeled some projects as being experimental, not aimed at theatrical release, to encourage people to try riskier ideas. He also funded some ideas considered to be unlikely, so failure did not become a stigma. But he still acknowledges that we have to try extra hard to make it safe to fail. If you are going to use odds, you also have to be able to calibrate them precisely, a hard task. Heads of business units will want to get to a P90 plan, one where they have a 90% chance of succeeding, while having the CEO see the plan as P50. The result is often an unspoken compromise. Stretch targets are set, but with baseline budgets, and the first level of incentive pay kicks in if the baseline goals are met. In other words, the CEO gets her stretch goals, but the executive team also gets softer goals that they expect to meet almost all the time. The problem is that the company might end up not pushing initiatives with the right level of ambition, and consequently not resourcing them appropriately to make a meaningful move up the power curve. The CEO needs to know what the odds really are to be able to calibrate goals and compensation appropriately. It's not only hard to set the right goals at the start of the year, but difficult to sort out causality at the end of the year because of the dust that gets kicked up behind you, making the road traveled hard to see in the rearview mirror. Did success come because of managerial decisions and great execution, or because of an error by a competitor and a favorable market? Did problems occur because bad weather killed demand during the key buying season, or because managers misjudged their customers? We know how the managers would vote on both questions. A prominent example of where a board got it right was when they appointed Wendell Weeks to be the CEO of Corning Glass in 2005. The board did so even though Weeks led the company's optical fiber business, which in the dot-com crash of 2001 had taken Corning almost to the brink. That problem was accurately attributed to the worsening market conditions, not management performance. In subsequent years, Weeks became one of the most highly regarded corporate leaders in America, leading Corning to be #1 globally in LCD glass, and with the help of Gorilla technology, #1 in smartphone cover glass as well. Judge from your own experience, but it strikes us that the clear judgment of Corning's board might be more the exception than the rule in terms of boards and CEOs accurately attributing performance. So, where are we now? We have now given you for the first time a glimpse at the probabilities of strategy, the odds that a company will move up or down on the power curve, and the notion that the probabilities for individual companies vastly diverge. We've also seen that dealing with probabilities is a challenge for business leaders, but that not properly dealing with them is one of the reasons that social games are being played. Now that the average probabilities of moving on the power curve have entered the room, the obvious next questions are, what is your own company's probability of success, and what actions can you take to improve that probability? How do you change your odds of beating the market? We tell clients that a plan that has a realistic chance of producing a real hockey stick that will carry a company from the middle to the top of the power curve should have an element of magic to it, something that stands out. Jokingly, we say, you should be able to smell the specialness through a video conference if you want to have some confidence that a hockey stick plan is the real deal. In the next chapter, we'll start to go into detail about how to find one.